Hey, what's going on, Team Trek family? Welcome back to another episode. In the studio tonight, I got two very special guests. I've got Kelsey and Paul Bock joining us tonight all the way from Nashville. Nashville?
Clarksville.
It's close. Yep. Yeah. We'll allow it.
Now, we talked about that a little bit on the first podcast, Paul, but
yeah,
it's what, 30 minutes? 45 minutes?
It's about 45 minutes.
Yeah, with traffic. Nowadays.
I'm horrible.
It's all right. It's Fort Campbell, Clarksville. I mean, Nashville, we're basically a suburb at this point with as many people as moving there at this point. So
that's awesome. So they made the 7-hour drive to get out here, sit on the podcast again. So you being our first, this is your first time on, Kelsey. So
it is, yes.
We need to dive into your story because we need to understand who you are, where you came from, how your life was growing up. If you were an athlete or chess club, like who were you growing up?
Okay,
right? If
we can do that. Absolutely. So yes, my name is Kelsey. Originally from Northwest Ohio. Grew up in Perrysburg. I was an only child. My dad was served in Vietnam, and my mom is just from a small town in Edgerton, Ohio. They met in a blind date, and I was a honeymoon baby, actually, so surprise to both of them. Childhood was great. Both my parents worked full-time. I went to public school, had a great school experience. Did not do sports because I tried soccer once when I was in either first grade or kindergarten, and still, 30-some years later, can still remember the coach yelling at me, and that just crushed my confidence. Instead of sports, I focused on the orchestra and played the violin for a number of years, and did a lot of art classes and zoo classes growing up. In the summers with my dad, we would do week-long bike trips for fun, where you would bike 30 to 60 miles a day, sleep in tents, and then do the same thing over for a week. It was a pretty uneventful, normal childhood. I say uneventful because I had never broken a bone, never had braces, never had stitches or anything. And then that all changed when I was 28, and we'll get to that here in a second. But in my childhood, I did meet Paul. I met Paul when I was about 9 years old. He moved in my neighborhood, and we played Ghosts in the Graveyard and did all those fun summer things. And then I think when I was about 12 or 13 is when you guys moved.
Yeah.
But we always stayed in contact. Back then we didn't have cell phones, but we had snail mail, so we would communicate that way. And
the phone cards. And
phone cards, yes. You'd have to either call after 9 or on the weekends. So that's how we kind of stayed connected. We dated a little bit in high school, but at that time he was still about 2 hours away from where I lived. He was my date to senior prom. And then after high school, we just needed to go our separate ways. I was very into my studies. I ended up going to college to become a nurse, and Paul, he went to school for a while, but that didn't go too far. And we just needed to go our separate ways after high school.
Yeah.
And I think that was good. And then we did see each other before you joined the military again in 2002.
2005.
That's right, because we graduated in 2003. So we saw each other in 2005 before you enlisted in the military. And I continued with my nursing degree, and then we got back together in 2008. So that's just a short little summary. Childhood growing up, I was not a Christian, was not raised in a Christian home. It was something that I was always interested in, but not knowing what to do with it and not being poured into spiritually by my parents. I didn't know what to do. I always wanted to go to church. My mom did take me a couple of times, but it was never something that we did on a regular basis. But having known Paul since an early age, he is definitely the one that introduced the Bible to me and just what being a Christian is. And I eventually accepted Christ in my freshman year of high school. But again, not having the guidance or a mentor, I didn't really know what to do with that. So I was a Christian like in the early 2000s, but didn't really start pursuing that relationship with Christ until Paul and I got back together in 2008.
And then you were a nurse.
I did, yep. So I graduated from the Ohio State University in 2008. I have my Bachelor's of Science in Nursing. I practiced nursing for about 5 or 6 years before I got sick. And in 2014, that's when I think our life really started to change.
Yeah. It was already kind of crazy.
It was crazy with deployments and military life. But yes, from a medical standpoint, is in 2014 is when things kind of definitely
went a little nuts.
Went crazy, yep.
And then a couple years later, I got retired. So and then she got to take care of me, and here we are. Now she's a teacher. She homeschools our daughter, and she teaches English, literature, and
grammar and writing
at a homeschool hybrid program locally. So she's got about 15 students that she really pours into, which is pretty cool to see.
It's fun.
That is awesome. So through that, and I appreciate it. You didn't, as a child, what kind of groups did you associate with?
Great question. For like my elementary, middle school years of school, I really only had one good friend. Lots of different reasons for that. I was never very confident in myself. I wouldn't say it was like the loser group, but definitely not the popular. But then I became really good friends with my best friend, who I'm still best friends with now, about 8th grade, 9th grade. And there was definitely a transition there. I was definitely more the band geek orchestra dork group. So not like the popular group, but not the misfits. We kind of we got along with everybody, really.
And I think there was a lot of that when we were growing up, right? Like, you could be associated with every group in this school, it seems like, just by way of who you grew up with in grade school, and they joined different groups and things like that. And of course, if you're an athlete, that just everything's a sport when you're a kid growing up. You talked about bike riding for 40 miles a day, and you say you were not an athlete. I don't know many people that can bike 40 miles a day.
Well, they did have a bike club in high school, so therefore I don't know if at that time it was really seen as a sport type.
Well, that was what your dad did, because her dad grew up doing that, biking all over the place, and so she did Ragbri how many times?
We've done Ragbri about like 6 or 7 times.
So that's Iowa. Yeah. And that's about 70 miles. It's about 70, 80 miles a day.
It is, yes.
So that's pretty crazy. And then her dad also was a parole officer, but he did a lot of stuff with the FBI. So that was
great stories.
It was some pretty funny stories, but also a bit intimidating for me on the front end of that.
Oh, I can imagine.
Yeah, and her dad is not a small guy. No. He's well over 6 feet, and and he always had because he was working with the FBI, always changing cars out, and so it was a little intimidating on my end.
It was.
So, but it was cool.
That definitely keeps things interesting when dad's a skilled, has a skilled profession like that. I definitely remember some stories of, people that had their fathers were in the military or in law enforcement, and being the boyfriend to that is never a fun. Yeah.
A little pressure.
I think it was helpful though that being that I knew you since I was 9, my dad knew you.
Yeah. And your mom liked me.
My mom has always loved you.
So that kind of helped.
That helped a lot.
That helps a ton. Absolutely. Okay, so that took us, so you graduated college, and you said you were a nurse for about 5 years. You practiced nursing?
5 or 6 years, yes.
Okay, what led you to that?
Great. That was good. So when I graduated high school, I knew that I wanted to go to college. Didn't know exactly what for. Being 18, I don't think most know what they want to do for the rest of their lives. When I went to college, I knew I wanted to do something either in the medical field or education, and I honestly chose the medical field because I thought 3/12s, that sounds great. I can work 3/12s a week and have the rest of my week to myself. So that's honestly kind of why I chose nursing. Maybe not the best reason to choose a career, but that's what I did. And I think it served me for a time, a season. But then now I am in teaching with homeschooling Sophia and teaching at the hybrid program.
That's awesome. So 15 kids
15
is
yes.
what you're teaching on a daily and homeschool program. So you have those 15 all day.
I have them all day on Tuesday. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's and in what age? You said that's middle
They're
school?
middle school. So last year they were 6th and 7th grade. I'll have the same group again this year. So now we'll be 7th and 8th grade.
How so being an educator of that age kids, would you say there's a huge difference between the way we grew up and the way that they're growing up as far as the social groups and things of that nature?
Absolutely. Yes. It's very different nowadays, for sure. Technology is a blessing and a curse. I think it's a little different for me, however, because our hybrid program is part of a full-time Christian school. So technology, although the school sees it as being important and something that our students need to know how to use, it's not something that they're in front of all day. So we do a lot more of like Christian education.
A lot more reading.
A lot more
A
reading.
lot more in the books versus trying to use the tablets and the computers as the tool. So that way there's that level of separation.
Correct.
So a healthy balance is really where it goes to with that. But
I still do see things.
yeah,
You know,
chats.
being the chats and, you know, outside of the classroom, I know that there are like a lot of things going on with text messages and different groups that are being formed outside of class. So definitely a lot different now than it was when we were kids.
I would definitely say it's more challenging for them in that, you know, because again, it's one of those things like we all know we'd have our groups, we'd meet and we'd hang out and we'd talk and stuff like that. But there's a level of access that the technology gives the kids and exposure to things that we didn't have to deal with back then. You know what I mean?
Sure, absolutely.
And which then adds a lot more different pressures on a whole scope of things. And then
Well, because they don't know how to handle it.
well, yeah, and that's the thing. They don't know how to handle it. And so with that, you know, you're seeing kids getting exposed to things that we didn't expose till like teenage years and as young as 6 and 7 because of the free access to the internet, really. So, and then bring that into the group chats and things like that, it completely changes the dynamic. And, you know, so as parents, you know, you've got to stay on top of it. And that's a challenge too. And so it's been really cool for me to watch her grow and thrive because basically she jumped into homeschooling right out. So started her in kindergarten. Was it kindergarten?
I started homeschooling Sophia when she was in kindergarten. It was something that we had always talked about as even before Sophia was born as an option for us. Like I said earlier, I had gone to public school and thought I had a phenomenal experience growing up. Paul had been homeschooled himself from like 2nd grade to 9th grade. Finished out his high school career at a public school. But homeschooling was always an option for us. And as we were getting closer and closer to figuring out what we wanted to do with Sophia as far as schooling, the Lord just made it perfectly clear that homeschooling was what we were supposed to do. And so Sophia hasn't known any different. So she is going to be going in 6th grade in the fall, and she's been homeschooled since kindergarten.
Yeah, I met her obviously tonight. She's a great girl. I don't notice any kind of social issue or anything. I mean, her and my daughter got together right away and say, "Hey, I'm
everybody
me, you're you.
her.
Let's go play."
Yep. Sophia has always made friends very easily. When we were in North Carolina, we'd go to the park and we would go home that day and it'd be my best friend Sally and my best friend Sam. And she is very much like Paul. She is a social butterfly, has no problem going up to a stranger and communicating.
Then we also do sports with her. You know, she's been involved in soccer from the time she was little. So and then plus church, and she's always had access to plenty of kids. And
there are a lot in the homeschool community nowadays. There are so many things that you could do outside of the home that you have to say no to, because if you said yes to everything, you would never do school.
Right.
Yeah.
So
that makes sense.
There's tons out there. And then with her nursing, you know, it was really good. It was actually really good, her having that background, because she always says when she did get diagnosed with cancer, it's great because she knows what's going on, but it's also kind of a curse because she knows what's going on.
Right. Maybe it's not as scary because you understand it better.
Yeah. And I was able to connect with the doctors and nurses, I think, in a way most patients aren't able to. I think that was helpful.
Yeah.
But then to just knowing the questions to ask was definitely helpful when I knew something wasn't right with, maybe it was something they said or just a way that I was feeling. I could dive a little bit deeper and ask the questions I needed to ask, or say, hey, something's not right here. And but yeah.
So for you, part of your journey becoming a nurse later in life really played a role later in life.
Absolutely.
So when we talk about things as like seasons, right? Like, okay, I did that for a few years or even 6 months, right? Sometimes it's just a season to pick up that skill set or whatever to be able to deal with what's coming, right? And I think that's one of the things that Paul did a really good job with on the last podcast was identifying those things and not dwelling on them and making them a problem as much as, okay, that's a thing and there's a solution to it. Let's figure that out.
But her thing was a bit different than mine because, with me, I got out and we talked about, it was definitely difficult, right? We talked about loss of community. We talked about the PTSD stuff that I was going through. But I was able to shift and still find things. For her, it was totally different. Where she lost her career.
Well, I was going to say it was a process.
Yeah.
I think both of our situations were not anything that we had planned.
Yeah.
Both answers to prayer. So my cancer diagnosis was an answer to prayer, as crazy as that is. And I went to work one night and I walked myself down to the ER because things just were not right. And I was diagnosed with leukemia. And for 9 months, it was, what do I need to do today to live tomorrow? And so I had 9 months of just fighting for every day. And then after those 9 months is when reality sunk in. And I realized, wow, I literally went to work one night and I walked down and my life completely changed. And everything, like my independence was taken. The mother I wanted to be, the wife I wanted to be was taken. My health, my independence, like everything was taken. And so I was good for those first 9 months, but then reality sunk in. And then it got real ugly for about 2 to 3 years after.
Yeah.
And during that time, I was fighting a lot of things. But going back to that nursing for a season thing, I wanted to hold on to being a nurse for so long during those 2 or 3 years after my diagnosis, because I was like, I went to school for that. I worked so hard for my degree. I only was a nurse for 5 years. I wanted to do this longer. It wasn't my decision or my choice to no longer be a nurse. But when I realized that I just needed to give it all up and give it to God, is when I realized that was just for then, and I need to move on. And honestly, I have no desire now to be a nurse. You wouldn't want me to be your nurse. I mean, I still have my nursing license that I renew every 3 years. Sorry, state of Tennessee. Probably not doing that legally. But I just had to learn and realize I just needed to give it up and do what God had for me and what he called me to next. And he called me to homeschooling. And it has been such a blessing to be able to homeschool Sophia because we're not able to have children naturally anymore because of cancer treatment. I am with Sophia every single day. And not a lot of mothers and fathers are blessed by that. And so as much as homeschooling can be a pain sometimes with Sophia and a almost teenager, it is such a blessing to be able to be with her every single day. And now teaching at the hybrid program, that is such a blessing as well, because through lots of counseling, I had counselors that would tell me, one day you are going to have more children, but just not the way that you would want them. And so it has been such an awesome way to have more children, 1 day a week for 6 or 7 hours, and then they get to go home to mom and dad. But they are amazing, and Paul knows them so well because he's come in to the class to do a Bible class with them, and so he's gotten to meet the 15 students, and even 3 weeks out, we're still talking about, well, this student that, and this student that, and they're an awesome, they're a good group of kids. So it's been good.
It was interesting because, on the initial she talked about that 2-3 years. It's easy to gloss over that, because we talk about things in snapshots and sound bites, and so it's easy to kind of think, oh, he did it great, he's doing fine, he did this, she did that, and it really does miss, like she said, it was 2 to 3 years of her struggling through that to get to that place. Because I'll never forget that one counselor talking to you about that, and that exact thing about having more kids, and she was so angry with that, and just because, again, that was right after, and so she's, like she said, she's dealing with the loss of all of this, and really kind of goes back to what we talked about a bit, just that identity. What is my identity? And she really had to struggle through and find that.
So you had a life-changing event happen.
Yep.
In a night.
Literally. And
you had to learn how to live a completely different version of yourself, right? Yep. None of the things that you personally wanted were possibilities anymore. You're gonna have to settle. You realize that you're gonna have to start settling for certain things. As you're telling that story, it made me think of soldiers that, they get hit. It's like that instance, they're in a firefighter, an IED, and their life is changed. But it's not just their life. It's the wife or the husband that they have, and it's impactful to everyone. The similarities that we can find within these traumas or these events, it's almost like they're the same. It's just it's a different version, but now you've got a story of that 2 years of struggle, right? That we gloss over. Somehow, you talked about it, figuring out how you're gonna stay alive for one more day. Mm-hmm. Right, one more day. 2 years of that, right? Or you said 9 months. Was that?
It was 9 months of actual treatment with chemo, and then I had a bone marrow transplant. Before my bone marrow transplant, however, I met with a doctor who told me what was going to happen, and I'm one of those, don't beat around the bush, just give it to me. And he did, and he talked to us for about an hour and a half, and then he ended the conversation with, you have a 25% chance of living 2 years after your transplant. And I was like, okay. And I went into my transplant, and there were 4 of us, and I am the only one that is still alive today. And so it was for the 9 months, one day at a time, just what do I have to do, minute by minute sometimes, just to get through. And then the 2 years after was, like I said, very ugly, but yeah, even now, I still live with that 25% chance.
Wow, I had no idea. I can't imagine. And Paul talked about on the last podcast that him being a caregiver, he can sympathize with other caregivers, and you didn't say sympathize. You can
empathize.
Empathize.
Yeah.
Thank you. How many people out there in the world are dealing with similar things, and nobody to empathize with them, right? Nobody that's a survivor like yourself that can talk through how you did it, how you got through those days, right? Because that's what's important, is how, okay, we have the event, we have the traumas that changed our lives, but how do we get through that? Yep. And what would you say to other women out there, other men out there that are dealing with similar things?
I think there's a couple different factors here. I mean, I had Paul, who definitely, we talk about this a lot. He drugged me along for a really long time. And he is the one that pursued the counselors for me at first. I didn't want anything to do with counselors. I wanted to figure it out on my own, do it on my own. I didn't know what to do. I didn't have any tools to handle that. When you're 28, 29 and you're healthy and living a normal life, and then you have this big event, nobody tells you. There is no guidebook on what to do in these situations. So I think through Paul's help and just dragging me along and more or less telling me what I needed to do at times, because I didn't know what to do. I think that's part of it. I think another part Paul would tell you would be thanks to my dad, the stubbornness. just the inability to quit. What makes my story, I think, a little different than some others is when the doctor told me I had leukemia. She's probably talked for like another 30 seconds or a minute, but I have no idea what she said because the Holy Spirit said, I've got this. All you need to do is walk it out. And I had like the numb tingling feeling from head to toe. So I knew during those dark times, I would always go back to that. Like, God, you said that you were going to get me through this, and you got me through this, but you're not going to leave me here in this dark place now. Like, you're not going to let me be the 25%, right? To just leave me here in this dark place and not know what's next and not know what to do. So I would always go back to that. And I knew because of that, of the Holy Spirit speaking and just being stubborn.
Yeah.
Thanks, Dad. That there was more to my life than what it was at that point. And so through counselors and just ultimately just submitting and just letting it be and having God speak to me and tell me what he wanted me to do instead of me trying to tell God what I wanted and what I wanted to do. Just that submission and just letting it go.
And that happened
it happened back in 2017 when we finally moved back. We were, so when I was diagnosed and my treatment was when we were in North Carolina. We ended up going to Houston for a while for my treatment. Went back to North Carolina, and then in 2017, so about 3 years after, we went back to Fort Campbell in Tennessee. And then that is when, sitting at the kitchen table, I heard God again say, Kelsey, it's not Kelsey, show God what you want. It's Kelsey, you need to let me, God, show you what I want. And that is when homeschooling was brought up and pursued. And like I said earlier, Paul I've known him since I was 9. He's the one that introduced me to the Bible and Jesus and God. Accepted Christ, like I said, when I was a freshman in high school. And then when we got back together in 2008 is when we both really started to pursue Christ and got involved in church and just growing our relationship with Christ and things like that. So when we got married in 2009, we were both Christians, probably not living the way that we really should have been living, even as Christians, but we were still pursuing and building a deeper relationship with Christ. I think probably what really kind of started actively pursuing Christ at a deeper level for me was we had 2 miscarriages before Sophia. And so that experience, I think, kind of dove me a little deeper into pursuing a relationship with Christ. And then Paul, too,
when I got home from Afghanistan.
When you got home from Afghanistan.
Because it was right before we lost the first baby 2 weeks before I went to Afghanistan. And then I had to come home to clear some funds real quick between UAE and Afghanistan. And then we got pregnant again. And then we lost the second baby when I was there.
Yep.
So I was still off on my thing, very nominal Christian, was a Christian, never doubt, we kind of talked about that. But as far as that pursuit, and again, it goes back to just people not pouring into us.
Right.
Not a lot of talk hey, this is how you actually pursue the relationship side of it.
Right.
So she had already started down that path after the babies had passed. And then for me, it was when I got home.
That was Chuck.
Yeah, that was Chuck. Yeah, with that. And then just really, so she kind of started before I did. And then that led into a whole host of things. Once we hit North Carolina, because I had, over those years, I hadn't been pouring into her like I needed to, because you know how it goes.
You were pouring into each other, into the team guys.
Yeah, team guys. You deploy, you come home, you get a few days off, a couple weeks, whatever, and then right back into it. And then so I know I played a lot of video games, a lot more than I should have, rather than just spending time with her and really pouring into her, which had built resentment in us over the years on her end. And so when I hit North Carolina, everything stopped, and I'm like, what do I do? And so I'm, again, just sitting in front of the TV on my time off, again, not pouring into her, but I'm pursuing the Lord. I'm getting deeper in the Bible, but I'm not leading her. I'm not really, like, we would go on dates and we'd spend a lot of time together during my leave, but after that it was just, again, I just wasn't there. And so that led into when she got sick, it was, I was able to be there for her and, like, spent a lot of time with her then. Like I said, did start there, but there was still that years of me not doing that. And so there was a lot that went into that. And so, like, we were both pursuing, but it was like we were there for each other, but it was the way we ended up going to Christian counseling a few years ago, because really she talks about like 2 to 3 years of a lot of darkness for her, but then I got
so our roles reversed again.
Yeah, roles reversed.
So now he's sick, and now I'm the caregiver.
Yeah.
And so we really couldn't be husband and wife for a lot of years. And so by the time that we did go to marriage counseling with a Christian psychologist, the way he described it was we're both sitting in our little bunkers, and we're lobbing messages out of our peepholes, and we're just not hitting the peephole of the other person. And we're just talking way past each other. And we really had to learn how to be husband and wife again, and what does that look like, and what does it mean to pour into each other and love each other, and like we had an understanding of it, and that was where both of us we were walking it out. Like when I got turned on to a book called The Way of Agape back when she was going through everything, and the whole premise, it was by Chuck and Nancy Missler, because he was a defense contractor, a lot of stuff, and their marriage was horrible. Their marriage was so bad, their kids they'd have Bible studies, and the kids would straight say to them, like, why would anybody want to go to your Bible study? Like, who would want a marriage like yours? That's their kids.
Wow.
And so in that process, she was going to leave him one night, and they got in a fight. It was the night she was going to leave him, got in a big fight, and he looked at her. She said, "Don't you want to worship God?" And she said, "I was not prepared for the answer he gave me." He said, "Will you let me?" And so she had to realize, she started to really step back and process, okay, what am I doing? Am I actually loving him? And in that process, and the book she discusses it, what they both really had to learn was that they can't get from their spouse what only God can give them. Because if I try to get from Kelsey what only God can give me, that's going to leave her feeling insufficient and me feeling unsatisfied. And so in that process, it's having the vertical relationship with God right, and letting him fill us, and that way we can then love that person unconditionally. It doesn't matter what I get from her. What matters is how I'm called to love her. And so I walked that out pretty heavily during those couple years as best as I could, but then it reversed, and then she did the same thing. But still in that, there was tons of issues, tons of problems that we had to work through about.
Well, I was going to say, being doing the caregiver role in a marriage is something that you typically aren't having to do until like you're in your 60s or 70s.
Yeah.
And here we are in our late 20s and early 30s having to navigate this, and you throw into that the military life and the deployments and then the miscarriages, and when I got sick, Sophia was only 14 months old. So there's all these things that most young married couples don't have to deal with on a daily basis.
Right. And that was one of the questions I wanted to ask you is you got more religious as you had your first miscarriage and then your second miscarriage, right?
Yep.
That brought you closer to God.
The first one did, for sure. The second miscarriage, there was a lot of anger associated with that.
Can we talk about that for a minute? Because I think a lot of people that are religious or semi-religious, however you want to call it, it's when bad things are happening to them, they want to blame God, and that tends to drive people away.
Yeah.
Can you talk on that?
Yeah, so I think we had actually started really pursuing Christ even before we got pregnant the first time. But that first miscarriage, that was hard. It was very hard. That was honestly probably harder than being told I had leukemia in the grand scheme of things. As crazy as that sounds. But yeah, I started really like pursuing Christ more after the first miscarriage, and just seeking why would God allow this? Like, what was the meaning? What did I need to learn from it? And honestly, I learned about perseverance through that. And then with the second miscarriage, I got very angry. And I forget how we were communicating, but we would like talk at night because I worked nights as a nurse, and we would communicate while I was at work. I don't remember how we communicated.
Phone, so I'd call every like 3-4 days.
But,
so you were in Afghanistan at this time, right?
Yeah. But there was a lot of anger on my part after the second miscarriage, and I know I took a lot of that out on him. Like, we shouldn't even try to have kids anymore. God clearly doesn't want us to have children. Like, why would he allow this to happen again? And then when he got home from Afghanistan and we got pregnant with Sophia, then, yeah, I think we started both really pursuing Christ again.
So you're home alone a lot now, right?
Yep.
Who was in your corner? So Paul's off fighting wars.
Yep.
He's on his journey doing that. Did you know a lot? So Paul was an 18 X-ray, so he came in right off the street and went into Special Forces.
Yep.
Did you know much about Green Berets or what you thought your life would look like being married to a Green Beret?
Not at all. No, not at all. In fact, I remember when right before he enlisted, he had called me before I saw you the last time, and you told me that you were going to be a Green Beret. And I got off the phone and I told my dad, I was like, yeah, Paul says he's going to be a Green Beret. My dad's like, huh, yeah, right. Okay. And I was like, okay, whatever. I don't know anything. So, you had already gone through the course and everything like that. He was already stationed at 5th Group, and that's when we got back together. And so, no, honestly, I had no idea what I was getting myself into. Maybe ignorance is bliss. I don't know. But we honestly enjoyed the military life.
It was different.
It was different, but it's what we knew. And like, I knew at the time that was his mission. That's what God had called him to do. And so when he was gone, I was a nurse. I took care of the house. We had 2 boxer puppies that I was busy with. As active as I could be in the church that we were attending at the time. And then, like, I spent a lot of time with family. Like, I would go to back to Ohio to see my parents a lot, and your parents as well when they were in Illinois. Yeah. So I just knew that that's how it had to be. I don't know if that is because I'm an only child and I'm okay with being by myself, like just how my dad raised me. It's just how it had to be. And was it hard? Absolutely. But I did what I needed to do and, stuck to my routine, work. And if I didn't work, then I would go to the gym and do what needed to be done. And yeah.
So how old, did you say Sophia was 18 months when you got diagnosed?
When I was diagnosed, she was 14 months.
14 months.
Yeah.
And so that initial diagnosis, how were you health-wise? Were you able to deal with everything?
Are you talking about when I was actually diagnosed? How was I health-wise?
Yes.
Well, I thought I was okay. I'd actually gone to the gym 2 days before my diagnosis and had worked out, and I was on the treadmill and was running. So I was diagnosed January 15th. Yeah. And so winter. And I had gone to the gym 2 days before, and I was running on the treadmill, and nobody had been feeling well for about a week before my diagnosis. So I was winded on the treadmill, which is kind of different than the normal. But I was like, we've been passing this bug around, so no big deal. That's why. So going into it, I was actually very healthy. This is typically a disease that like 60 or 70-year-olds get, not 28-year-olds. So yeah, I was relatively healthy, and that obviously helped to go through the cancer treatment. And I started cancer treatment 2 days after I was diagnosed.
Yeah.
And I would have doctors come in every morning and they would be like, "How do you feel?" And I was like, "I feel great. I never got sick. I never threw up. I never had any GI issues. I was actually gaining weight during cancer treatment."
Yeah, it was crazy.
It was crazy.
It was. So when we say like that whole thing about God answering prayer,
Yeah.
Yeah.
the way he took care of her was insane.
Yeah.
Absolutely insane.
There was not one thing I had to worry about. Sophia was taken care of. We had good family friends that she stayed with for the first 2 weeks of my diagnosis. You called somebody that you worked with because the hospital that I ended up being transferred to UNC, Chapel
Okay.
Hill, which is about an hour and a half away from where we lived at the time.
Yeah.
So you called a friend and he was able to get the Care Coalition
Yeah.
set up, and they had a 3-bedroom apartment for Paul and my parents within like days of my
Yeah.
diagnosis.
Yeah,
I was gonna say he called Sergeant Major, and Sergeant Major was like, "You're on TDY. Your job is to be with your wife."
they
So
took
there
care
was
of me. It was
literally
awesome.
nothing that I had to think about or worry about other than what do I have to do today. And like I said, I didn't get sick at all from any of the chemo.
Any of the treatments. Now, you were talking about chemo, Rain. But what is that? I'm not 100%
Oh, earlier
familiar.
we talked about it. Yeah. So and that was so post and that 2 to 3 year period, that was really hard. Was part of it was the chemo brain because she was on oral chemo for a year.
About a year and a half after my transplant
Yeah.
as well.
So basically, chemo brain. If you think about like our TBIs and like our memory issues, or we'll forget things instantaneously as short term memory. She had that, where we would have full conversations, make decisions for our family, and then I would enact it, and then within 5 minutes, and she'd be like, "Why are you doing this? Why didn't you talk to me about this?" Just she wouldn't remember whole conversations that we would have. Then obviously dealing with the memory,
Yeah.
emotions, all that stuff that plays that role with that. So
there's a lot, like I can recall such vivid details of the 9 months that I was undergoing treatment from the time I was diagnosed to the day we got home back to North Carolina. But then like the next 2 to 3 years, there's a lot that I don't remember like at all, with
It's just-
Paul and Sophia and just, yeah, a lot of different things. But those 9 months, very vivid details that I can recall.
How was it for you? I mean, you redeploy. You're still healthy at this point.
yeah.
You weren't having any medical issues at this point.
Well, actually, you were.
I was, we just didn't realize it. But so you're talking like once. So how was I doing with?
So
the
you
process,
basically
or-
you redeployed.
Yeah.
And then you weren't home for very long before because you were home for your daughter's birth.
Correct. And then we went to SWIC then
Yeah.
in 2013.
Yep.
And then April 2013. And then I was diagnosed January 2014. So we were only in North Carolina for about, 6 or 7 months before I was diagnosed. And so he actually was able to extend his SWIC tour. So we were in North Carolina for a total of 4 years.
Yeah.
So he didn't deploy during that time. And then when we went back to Campbell in 2017, so about 3 years after my transplant,
Yeah.
is when he redeployed.
Yeah.
Were you getting so as soon as this happened and you found out, where are you at? I know you're instructing. You've got your life going.
That was a whole thing that I did talk about in the last episode. They'd pulled me into that school's position.
Yeah.
And so I wasn't an instructor yet. When I got back is when I started working at SFAS.
That's right.
So that actually worked out well with the scheduling because I was able to be
With
home
me.
for her. And I mean, there were times that she'd be calling me and be like, "Hey, I got to go to the ER like now." And fortunately they would be like, "Go." And so
Right.
I was able to haul out and grab her and head to the ER. So but that was what was interesting. Well, not interesting, but it was my buddy Justin. Justin Jones. He was one of the Thor instructors. She got diagnosed, and he was praying for us. And he called me, and he said, and this played out over the next
Couple years.
Yeah, well, I'd say 8 years.
Yeah.
Back to until 2022, really, where he said, "I saw you two." He said it was so vivid. "I saw you two, and you were walking down a black tunnel, and the darkness would just creep in. And right before it overtook you guys, just a little light would burst through, and you'd be able to walk forward a couple extra steps. And then the darkness would start to come in again. And then light would shine through. And
That's true.
yeah.
It's
And
very true.
I will never forget, because she asked me, did we make it? Like, what happened at the end? And he said, I don't know. And that, not to get emotional, but that's so very...
Didn't he share that with us?
Yeah,
right after.
It was right after she got diagnosed.
So no, it wasn't right after I got diagnosed.
It was close around that time.
Oh, I remember when it was.
Okay, so you remember.
Let me tell the story.
Tell the story.
So I was diagnosed January 15th, started treatment, and I was doing great. Blood work showed that leukemia was going into remission. About 2 weeks after my diagnosis, I'm still in the hospital, and they find out through having done further testing in my bone marrow that it's best that I have a bone marrow transplant.
Yeah.
They can get me into remission, but the type of mutations I had were very notorious for coming back. And I was like, well, I'm never doing this again. So what do I need to do to get rid of it? And they were like, bone marrow transplant. And I was like, okay. So I was in the hospital for about a month.
Yeah.
I was doing great. They sent me home, and I knew that I was going to be home for about 2 weeks or so before I started my next round of treatments. And I was probably going to have my bone marrow transplant in a couple of months because they needed to find a donor, and it takes a while. So until they can get you into transplant, you keep getting chemo every so often to keep the leukemia away. And anyways, I went home after a month. I was home for probably about 10 days, and I went back for another bone marrow biopsy, which was routine, and thinking everything was going great. And went back the next day then for my results, and the doctor came in with a box of tissues, and he said, you're actually worse now than when you were first diagnosed. And it was a shock to everybody, because I, in all intents and purposes, looked like I was doing great, felt great, blood work looked great, but bone marrow said otherwise. And it was actually that drive home.
Yeah, that's right.
Because what came up on my end was how I had been faithful in what God had called me to do and to walk out this cancer journey. And even though at times I wasn't necessarily the one ministering to cancer patients, Paul was able to. And so that's when
That's right.
we talked about, well, I had been faithful. How can God let this happen? Like, how can I be worse now after having started treatment than I was before? And then it came up that we were sent to MD Anderson.
Yeah.
And so that was the night that, because I remember him calling you and you telling me about that.
Yeah. Because that was a really hard drive home, obviously, because it's, like she said, thought we were doing good. And as we were talking about that whole thing, the conclusion we both came to as we were discussing it was God really saying, hey, you were faithful on a floor, because UNC Chapel Hill's a floor for cancer. So I'm going to take you to a whole hospital to do this. And so what confirmed that was they ended up, again, we don't know who paid for the life flight jet. She actually had a medical jet fly her down to MD Anderson. And in that process, we get there, I'm down in the lobby talking to people, and she calls me, she's like, you need to get up here, like, now. So I run up to the hospital room where she's at, and I remember this so vividly. She looked at the doctor, said, tell him what you just told me. And he says, I don't know how to say this, but like, you're in remission. Yeah. And yeah.
Yeah.
So you went from being worse off than when you began treatment.
Yeah. And when they told me I was worse off, they said,
flight.
we unfortunately can't do anything for you here at UNC. Trial drugs, things like that. They said, you need to go to MD Anderson. They have access to those drugs that you need to get in remission before you can have your transplant.
Okay.
So unfortunately, medical, just like military, hurry up and wait. I think I was at UNC for probably another week and before I was sent to MD Anderson. And during that time, they couldn't do anything for me. They could give me blood products, but there was no treatment that they could give me for the leukemia because they needed me to be able to get into those clinical trials. So week later, I end up med flighted down there, like Paul said. Don't know to this day who paid for that flight. Don't even want to know how much that cost, but it was a lot, I'm sure. And admitted into MD Anderson, and they did another bone marrow biopsy. And the next day they came up with the results, and they were like, the doctor actually came in and he's like, "Why are you here?" And I was like, "Because I have leukemia and I'm worse off now than I was after my initial treatment, and I need to be in remission for my bone marrow transplant." He's like, "Well, you're in remission." And I was like, "Wait, what?"
Yeah. And so what we felt in that was God had said, "Hey, look, I did what I needed to get you here. It's going to be okay from now." And again, it was just all those little things, the little things that kept occurring that just kind of gave that confirmation of like, hey, it's going to be okay. I've got this.
That doesn't mean that there weren't bad things.
No,
there were plenty of bad things that we experienced.
Yeah.
But
so
there were always those little
shots of light.
Yeah.
I'm just blown away. What happened during that week, right, where UNC tells you you're in worse shape?
Well, I mean, I know what happened.
Yeah.
It's a God thing. Because I did ask my leukemia specialist, Dr. Pomeraju.
Yeah.
And I was like, "Can you tell me why?" And he said, "There is no medical reason or explanation as to why you are in remission." And it was so bad that MD Anderson requested the bone marrow samples that they had taken at UNC probably like at this point 2 weeks prior and tested it themselves. And they were like, "Yes, UNC was correct. You were at this like 82% blast, but we're showing that you're now at 4% blast count." It was a God thing.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
Wow. So now you guys are at the hospital. You said God brought you to the hospital to be able to basically be able to pastor to people that were having or that were going through cancer treatments and things of that nature, right?
Yep.
Talk me through that a little bit. You said, is that where you really got, I guess, the bug to then go on to get your master's in theology? Or
no, so
how did...
I think we just knew that this was our mission field at this time.
Yeah.
And so this is what... And
it walked out in a lot of different ways.
It walked out in a lot of different ways. And that, over the years, that's what Paul and I have come to realize, that, God puts you in certain places for different reasons, but all you need to do is walk out the Christian life, share the gospel, tell people about Christ, share your story with people.
And sometimes it's just being an ear.
Sometimes it's just being an ear.
And so it played out, like I said, it played out in a lot of different ways. Sometimes it was, we shared the gospel with some people, and sometimes it was just being hope for them and just comfort and just loving on them. Hey, just praying with them, because you're talking people in a very, very dark place. Right. I mean, MD Anderson it
has a dark cloud over it.
It's a very dark cloud over it. Monday those doors open and it is a flood of bodies, and they're all cancer, every single one of them. And it's an entire, if you think of like a university campus and how big those are, it's a whole hospital campus, and it's all cancer of all different types. And there's a lot of hopelessness in that, a whole lot of hopelessness, because a lot of them are terminal, and especially the kids section. Like, you got tons of kids there with cancer. So you got parents that are going through this process with their kids. And that was, it was great, but it was also very hard, because you got to walk that with them in some very unique ways, and you hurt with them, you love them. And so it was, for us, it was really kind of an honor, because it's like, I'm going to put you in a very, very difficult battle. And there's so much that he's doing in that process beyond just, I just need you here for these people. I just need you here to minister or to love on them or pray with them or just be there just to listen to them. It's, he was also doing so many things in us during that time period. And even though we had a lot of dark times for ourselves, and it was very hard for both of us in our marriage, and, the why and the anger and things that went on. And it's, he was, it's at that strategic level that you can't even see everything that he's doing, because he's teaching you to die to yourself. He's teaching you, faith is easy to talk about when life's good. We're in America. We're comfortable.
Right.
There's a pastor that calls this the Disneyland of America, and it's probably one of the hardest countries to be a Christian because there's nothing but distraction and comfort.
Right.
It doesn't cost you anything. And so in this process, it's that like, hey, you still gonna have faith? You gonna follow me? Like, are you gonna worship me? It's easy when life's going good, but what about when it's hard? How do you really believe? Do you really believe I'm good? Do you really believe that I know what I'm doing and you're gonna trust me? And you say I'm worthy of your worship and that you love me. And he obviously demonstrated his love for us by giving his son, which is just an incredible thing to think about. Right. But are you going to like? It's just like anything. Like, hey, I'm an operator. Okay, can you operate? What happens to those guys? They get kicked off the team. They get benched. And so it's very similar in that he's building so many things into you that you never would learn otherwise. And then again, on the connection side, like, she could never connect with people with cancer the same way. She couldn't connect with women that have lost pregnancies the same way if she'd never gone those things herself.
That's right.
And so, that's where trust, because it's at such a high level, like, hey, operate, go operate. And if you really do trust me now, because faith is trust. And like I said, it's easy to say I trust and I love God and I'm willing to serve him when it's easy. There was a guy, David Livingstone of Africa, incredible missionary. He went to Africa. His wife couldn't handle the diseases, so she actually went back to Scotland. This is the 1800s. So for 5 years, he was in Africa by himself, just sharing the gospel, village to village. And then he went back to Scotland. They traveled, telling everything, and basically he was like, my heart's still there. And so she said, I'll go with you. And he buried her shortly after they went back. And he dedicated the rest of his life to that. And he ended up, I believe it was him, he was so weak at the end, they would literally have to carry him village to village to preach and to share the gospel. But he had such a love for those people, and he had such an honor for the Lord and a heart of service that he chose that's what his desire. And it goes back to the mission, that thing greater than yourself. Right. That when you realize what truth is, and when you realize that depth of love, it's the abandonment. It's a love that is willing to abandon all for a love that abandoned all. And so there was so much he was doing in both of us at that time, even though we couldn't see it. I mean, even like that, when you're talking that journey for us to really get where we're at, I mean, it was 2022. Like it was 2022 when we really finally were like, okay, yeah. So you're talking, a long time to walk this out and so much pain. But, I know we wouldn't give, if we had to choose on the front end, of course we would say no. But on the back end, even though it was a very, very long, very dark time in both of our lives, I would not want to change one thing, because it's why we are who we are. It's why we have the marriage that we do. It's why we have the faith that we do, and it's why we have the love that we do for him and for other people. Because she talked about submission, and so it's really that you're going to either submit or you're not, and it's so much easier when you just say, okay, I do trust you, because he gives you what you need to walk it out that day. It may not, you get to that point, and guys understand this plenty on the teams, and when you're in the transition process or all the stuff we go through, like, you can't even think about, it's too much to think about tomorrow. It's too much to think about next week. Right. I can only think about today. But he'll give you that. He'll give you what you need to get through that day. And that's, again, part of that training process. Like, life's a selection process.
That's right. On the last podcast, and we talked about it a little bit, but you mentioned a quote that, I don't remember it verbatim, but if you weren't part of the conflict of your time, then did you really?
He was not part of the. He was. I can't remember the exact, but it's basically like Walter Martin said it in his Christianity in Crisis. And he said, he who is not participate in the conflict of his time, of him it can be said he never truly lived. And so we tend to think of that as a combat thing, right? Oh, I didn't deploy, I didn't do this, I wasn't part of the military, that was not what he was talking about. He was talking about the conflict of our nation right now and the conflict in the church.
Right.
Because there is a conflict in the church right now. You know, much of the church is very culture-based. Like, let's appeal to the culture, let's accept the culture, because we want to be relevant. And, you know, they love to say, oh, Jesus hung out with the sinners. He did this. Yeah, he did. He loved them. He died for them. Of course he did. But he also called them to repentance. He called them to that's the whole thing. It's like he called them to something better. And that's the thing that we've learned in this is that there's a vast difference between happiness and joy. And there's a vast difference between silence and peace. Because you can be in the midst of incredible struggle and pain and still have peace and still have joy. Because that's so much deeper and so much more sustaining, and it's fulfilling.